like and subscribe, and leave a comment below. Beyond Antarctica, Chapter 30. "We must hold the breach, John. If they get in here, their numbers will overrun us," Tony shouted. Just then the ram came free from the door with a deafening crack. It rang out like a church bell cracking, shattering the silence with a screechy tone that reverberated in the large space. "Security, with me," Jackson barked as his men snapped into position. "We back up the big guy at the breach." As Jackson issued his orders, a voice boomed from the other side of the breach, echoing through the dimly lit chamber. "Stand down and surrender. Lay on the floor, arms and legs spread before we enter. You have 10 seconds to comply. We're sending someone in." The crew turned to John, waiting for his command. John's face was a mask of calm determination as he simply shook his head, the gesture a clear and silent no. It was clear to all in the room. There would be no surrendering. Bob, standing tall, let out a gruff chuckle, his grip tightening on the shotgun. "I guess we're going to do this the hard way," he muttered, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down the spines of everyone in the room. As Jackson and his men took up positions directly behind Bob, joining Tony as they braced themselves for the onslaught. With every breath, every heartbeat counting down to the inevitable clash, a small head appeared in the breach, peering around the edge ever so slowly. It was a young girl, no older than 12, her wide eyes filled with fear. She turned over her shoulder, with her voice trembling as she reported back. "Sir, they're not complying." Murmurs of disbelief echoed from the security forces outside. The girl's small voice, shaking with the weight of her task, called out again, "Comply and surrender. Lay down. Spread out with legs and arms extended." Her voice wavered as she stepped fully into the breach, but just as she put one leg through the opening, ready to step in, Bob's deep growl filled the room like a thunderclap. "Child or no child," Bob bellowed, "you take one more step through that hole and I'll remove your head from your body." He lifted the shotgun, the barrel now mere inches from the girl's head as he stepped forward, with his massive frame blocking the breach completely. Kim screamed in horror. "Aw, hell no, that's a child." She knew things were spiraling out of control. The situation was teetering on the edge of disaster. Cooler heads had to prevail. In a burst of panic, she lunged forward, in a dead sprint ready to intervene. But her father's strong arm shot out, scooping her up in mid-stride. John twisted in a circle from the force of her charge, holding her tightly as she thrashed in his arms. "No, Kim, you're staying right here with me and Todd," John commanded. The fury in Kim's eyes was intense, with her body shaking violently in her father's grip. "Let me go," she shouted, with her voice straining with desperation. The girl at the breach, her courage faltering in the face of Bob's overwhelming presence, slowly stepped back, her wide eyes locked on the towering man before her. Bob looks over his shoulder for a moment, noticing Kim and her concern, swiftly said, "Tony, heads up," tossing him the shotgun and then returning his gaze to the girl. From the other side of the door, a voice shouted, its tone laced with frustration. "We're coming in. You're all going to be taken into custody and given a choice, the mines or death." Bob's voice, cold, cut through the tension. "You forget there is a third option. We can go out in a blaze of glory, taking as many of you with us as we can." With that, Bob charged the hole, filling the breach with his massive frame. He towered over the girl, with his eyes locking onto hers with a resolve that made her tremble in fear. The girl, her small body dwarfed by the mountain of a man before her, took a hesitant step back, with her eyes wide with terror. The room fell silent as everyone watched the tense standoff, the girl's fear noticeable as she took in the sight of Bob, a man who seemed more like a force of nature than a human being. From the shadows behind the girl, shouts rang out, orders hurled her way with urgency. She turned to Bob. "I said down to the ground now," as a man's voice filled the background commanding her to act. The girl, steadying herself against the overwhelming fear, stood tall, with her small frame trembling as she held her ground. She stepped forward, her hand gripping the sparking club tightly, The energy crackled as she lunged at Bob's left arm, with the club sparking violently as it connected. Bob quivered for a moment, his body tensing from the shock. Bob shook it off like a dog after a bath, muttering under his breath, "You will have to do better than that, little one." With a swift motion, he grabbed her wrist with his right hand, twisting it with enough force to wrench the club from her grasp. The club flew into the air, sparking above her head before clattering to the ground, useless. With his left arm, he quickly grabs her by the chest, hoisting her into the air. Her body goes limp in fear from the raw power and strength he possessed. Staring her eye to eye, he screamed, spraying her with spit in the process, almost foaming at the mouth with anger. "Are you going to make me hurt you, little one?" he shouted. Kim screamed in fear. "Bob, no!" But John, with his voice a low whisper, gently urged, "Let Bob do his thing. He doesn't want to hurt her. He doesn't want to hurt any of them. But right now, he has to do what's necessary to protect us all." "Enough!" Jackson's voice rang out as he stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation before it spiraled further out of control. Bob, still holding the girl, staring into her eyes with an intensity that made her shudder. The room was thick with tension, every second loaded with the potential for violence. "Security officer," Jackson addressed the girl, his tone firm yet respectful. "Tell your commander I wish to speak. There is a way out of this. Have him come in alone, and I will send out half my security team in good faith, surrendering. I ask for the respect of a conversation first, before following Hope's orders blindly." The girl, still held aloft by Bob's iron grip, nodded weakly, with her fear evident. Jackson's voice was calm, yet there was an underlying authority that couldn't be ignored. The security forces outside hesitated, unsure how to proceed as the situation teetered on the brink of chaos. Bob slowly lowered the girl as a low, primal growl rumbled from deep within his chest, almost animalistic in its intensity. His eyes never left hers, the unspoken message clear. He was a force not to be trifled with. As the girl's feet touched the ground, she trembled from the sheer power radiating off the man before her. She shouted out their demands, while her backup relayed the orders to the command center in the back lines, ensuring they reached the commander as they anxiously awaited his response. John leaned in close to Kim and whispered, Bob's mostly growl, love. He was trying to intimidate them, to avoid doing what he'd hate to have on his conscience for the rest of his days. He'd rather scare them into submission than be forced to cross a line he can't come back from. The tension in the air was thick, every breath heavy with the weight of the choices that lay ahead, as Bob's resolve to protect his crew by any means necessary was clear for all to see. In the dim light of the room, the crew stood ready. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and standing on the precipice of disaster. But they were not broken. They had come too far, faced too much to surrender now. The girl shuffled off with haste, her small frame disappearing quickly into the shadows as the commander of the security regiment for this sector stepped forward, flanked by a guard on either side. They stood on their side of the breach, with their eyes scanning the room. "Yes, Jackson, I'm here," the commander said, "but this conversation doesn't start until I see half your men leave this room and head down the hall. They'll be held safely and treated with respect until we conclude our discussion. Don't mistake this for weakness. I'm here to hear you out. Hope has been acting strangely of late with all the power outages and now calling for your arrest, as well as the arrest of the entire ruling class. That is strange to say the least, so say your piece while I still have patience." Before the commander could say another word, Bob's voice boomed through the chamber, thick with anger. "Before I let you speak any further, I want to know which one of you cowardly weasels sent that little girl in here to do your dirty work. You three should have been here from the start instead of hiding in the back ranks like cowards." Bob's words hung in the air like a challenge, with the weight of his accusation freezing the room in its tracks. His eyes locked onto the commander, the intensity of his glare unmistakable, just as Bob tensed, ready to charge forward to put a beat down on someone. Tony stepped in front of him, placing a gentle hand on his chest. "No, my friend. Not now," Tony said softly. "Not yet, at least," looking over his shoulder at the commander. The tension in Bob's muscles slowly eased, as if Tony had some magical power to bend him to his will with the lightest touch. Reluctantly, Bob stepped back, with a low growl still rumbling in his chest, akin to a lion in anticipation of a large meal. The commander's eyes widened in shock, clearly taken aback by Bob's claim. It was as if the realization hadn't even dawned on him until now, and the truth of the situation hit him with the force of a hammer. Just then, Jackson stepped forward, with his question cutting through the tension. "Destin, isn't it? Your name, I mean." "Yes," the commander replied, with his tone cautious, as if in shock that the leader would know who he was by name. Jackson's lips curled into a sly smile. "How would you like to live longer than 25? He asked, the smirk on his face challenging the commander's understanding of everything he'd been taught. Destin's eyes narrowed, with duty and suspicion warring within him. "Wouldn't we all?" he replied, glancing at his two guards. Jackson glanced over his shoulder and called out, "Hey, John, come here." As John stepped forward, Jackson turned back to the commander. "This is no joke, Destin. What if I told you we've been lied to our entire lives, that we've been deceived from birth, never allowed to grow old enough to understand how the world works, let alone how life should be lived?" The commander and his guards stared at Jackson in disbelief, their expressions hardening. "Yeah, you're one of those," Destin said, with his voice tinged with skepticism. "I can see why we're supposed to arrest you now." "Hold up," Jackson interjected, raising a hand to stop the commander. "I want you to meet John." He gestured to John, who stepped forward, his face illuminated by the dim light. "Commander, this is John. Look at his face. Look at what seems to be a disease or some birth defect. Those are age marks." John stepped closer. "They're called wrinkles, and they come with age," he explained. He then stated his age, leaving the three men in stunned silence, their eyes widened with shock. "Wow, just wow," the commander finally muttered, with his disbelief evident as he stared at John. "If you'd just told me the story, I wouldn't have believed you, but here he is, standing right in front of us." Stepping through the breach, the commander paused for a moment before asking, "Bob, may I enter?" taking a good look at the crew, with his eyes darting around the room. Bob, still towering over the group with an imposing presence, nodded slightly. "As my guest, my friend, join us. Have a look for yourself." Destin stepped into the room, with his eyes scanning the faces of the crew, each one marked by the passage of time in ways he had never seen before. He looked around in total amazement, the reality of their situation slowly sinking in. Jackson's voice broke through his thoughts. "We can all live to be much, much older." The commander turned to Jackson, with disbelief still coloring his features. "How old?" he asked. Jackson smiled. 100 years, maybe more, maybe 500, even 700 years old. Who knows what's possible? Destin shook his head, struggling to process what he was hearing. "No, this can't be. It just can't be." One of his guards, with his face twisted in anger, suddenly shouted, "You're liars trying to deceive us. Commander, you must do your duty. You're putting all of humanity at risk." Todd stepped forward from the background. "No, it's the truth. Ask the AI hologram interface yourself." He turned to the hologram. "Repeat back what you told us." The hologram flickered to life, its voice emotionless as it recounted the information. The guards listened in stunned silence, with the weight of the revelation crashing down on them like a tidal wave. Destin's face grew pale as the reality of the situation became clear. "But Jackson," he said, with his voice shaking slightly, "if we don't arrest you, they'll arrest us all. Or worse, Hope might give up on us entirely and seal this section off, leaving us to our demise." The room fell into a tense silence, with the implications of their choices hanging heavy on their minds. Each person knew that the decisions made in the next few moments could change the course of their lives, and the lives of everyone in the facility, forever. This is not goodbye, nor the end. Until the story continues, my friends. B.N.Rocker.